First time camping, I had just turned 24 when I decided to finally give camping a shot. I didn't want it to be some group trip where I'd have to rely on others or share the experience. I wanted to go all out, completely alone, just me and the wilderness. To make it even better, I decided to hike a closed trail in the mountains of Oregon. I figured, nobody else will be there. I'll have the whole trail to myself. Looking back, it was both the best and worst idea I've ever had. I packed what I thought I'd need, but I wasn't exactly experienced. My backpack was way too heavy, stuffed with gear I probably didn't even need. I had a snug sleeping bag, my Snugpack ionosphere tent, a flashlight, my Bowie knife, and a cheap Bluetooth radio I thought would keep me company at night. Water, snacks, and a small first aid kit rounded out my supplies. I'd watched enough survival videos to feel confident, but confidence doesn't mean much when you're out there alone. From the moment I stepped onto the trailhead, I felt off. It wasn't the trail itself. There was something about the quiet, the type of quiet that felt unnatural. My biggest fear has never been bears, snakes, or coyotes. No, it's cougars, the silent killer. They're almost impossible to spot, and by the time you do, it's too late. That thought stuck in my head as I hiked deeper into the forest. The trail was overgrown but still manageable. My legs burned from the incline, and my back ached from the weight of my pack. I didn't have my glasses with me, so everything beyond 30 feet was just a blur of green and brown. It was like trying to see through a foggy window. Shapes and outlines were there, but nothing sharp. A few hours in, I thought I saw something. It was just a shape at the edge of my vision, low to the ground, and moving slowly. My heart rate spiked. Cougar? I froze, gripping the strap of my pack tightly. But when I squinted, it didn't move again. Probably just my imagination, I thought. Still, the thought stayed with me. By the time I found a spot to set up camp, I'd burned through most of my water and felt exhausted. The area was a small clearing just off the trail, slightly sloped but flat enough to pitch my tent. I knew the slope wasn't ideal, but I told myself it'd help any rainwater flow away from my tent if it rained. I set up quickly, eager to rest, and then tried to build some kind of wood shelter for extra protection. It didn't take long for me to give up, scattering sticks around my tent instead as a sort of camouflage. Looking back, I'm not sure what I thought I was protecting myself from. As the sun dipped lower, I started hearing voices. They were faint at first, like whispers carried by the wind. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me, but then I saw them, a couple walking along the trail. My stomach sank. The trail was supposed to be closed. Why were they here? I crouched behind a tree, watching them until they disappeared out of sight. The rest of the evening was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I climbed into my tent and turned on my Bluetooth radio, hoping the music would drown out my nerves. That's when I heard the voices again, closer this time. They were speaking Spanish. My blood ran cold. It was pitch dark by then. Who the hell hikes a closed trail at night? I turned off the radio, straining my ears. The voices were getting louder. I panicked and did the dumbest thing I could have done. I yelled out, "Hello!" The voices stopped. Silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my Bowie knife and unzipped my sleeping bag, ready to move if I had to. I tried again, my voice shaking, "Hello!" Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps crashing through the brush, coming up the slope toward my tent. I bolted out of the tent, barefoot in my long johns, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other. I shouted as loud as I could, threatening whoever or whatever it was. I yelled about being armed, about being crazy, hoping to scare them off. The footsteps stopped. The forest was dead silent again. No wind, no animals, nothing. My flashlight beam shook as I scanned the trees. After a few minutes of standing there, my adrenaline started to wear off. I didn't see anyone. Slowly, I crept back to my tent and climbed inside, leaving the knife within arm's reach. Couldn't sleep. Every little noise set me on edge. At one point, I called my best friend to let him know where I was, just in case something happened. But the signal was terrible. I could barely hear him, and he couldn't understand me. That's when it really hit me. I was completely alone out there. Hours passed. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to the sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. My body froze. The sticks I'd scattered earlier were meant to make noise if something got close, and now they were doing their job. I held my breath, straining to hear. First, there was nothing. Then, a low, heavy exhale. It wasn't a sniff, but more like a deep huff. My mind immediately went to one thing: cougar. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The word prey kept flashing in my mind. I'd never felt anything like it before. Pure, unfiltered dread. I knew if it was a cougar, any sudden movement could trigger it to pounce. Minutes felt like hours. Every few moments, I'd hear the faint sound of something shifting outside. Then, the unmistakable sound of lips smacking, like an animal licking its chops. I stayed still until the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. The birds started chirping, and the forest came alive again. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The ground around my tent was covered in paw prints. Big ones. Each print was the size of my palm. I didn't need to measure them to know what they belonged to. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands trembling the whole time. As I hiked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the cougar stalking me. When I finally reached the parking lot, I collapsed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there for what felt like hours, just trying to process everything. Eventually, another car pulled in. 2 teenagers got out, chatting in Spanish, and headed down the same trail. I wanted to warn them, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I drove home in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I'd gone out there looking for solitude, but I found something else entirely. Something I'll never forget. I was 17 when my dad first took me on a hunting trip deep in the wilderness of Montana. It was late October 2006, the kind of time when the forest starts to feel colder, darker, and quieter. Dad had always been a reserved man, never one to share too much, so he didn't bother telling me exactly where we were going. He simply shook me awake at 5:30 in the morning, his gruff voice urging, "Come on, grab your stuff." Groggy but excited, I threw on my gear, grabbed my rifle, and followed him out to his old Ram 1500 pickup truck. A small trailer was hitched to the back, our makeshift home for the next few nights. The drive to the site was long, about 3 hours down winding roads that seemed to stretch into nowhere. Trees hugged the gravel road on either side, their towering forms blocking out the weak morning light. We didn't talk much during the drive. Dad never was one for idle conversation. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the occasional static-filled country song playing on the radio. We arrived at a clearing just before noon. The forest surrounding us felt dense, almost suffocating, with tall pines and thick underbrush creating an endless maze. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Dad parked the truck and we set to work. He got the fire going while I helped set up the trailer. By the time we finished, it was already late afternoon. We sat by the fire for hours, eating some canned chili and staring into the flames. The silence of the woods felt heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. At around 10:30, we decided to call it a night. The next morning, we woke up early, just before dawn. The air was freezing, our breath visible in the dim light as we packed up our gear and headed to the hunting site. Dad led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, while I followed closely behind. The forest felt different that morning, quieter than the day before, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. We started looking for tracks, focusing on deer and elk. After about an hour, we came across some fresh deer prints and began to follow them. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a deer skull. At first, it didn't seem too strange. Skulls aren't exactly rare out here, but something about it felt off. The skull was clean, almost polished, but there was fresh blood smeared across the bone. Dad stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable, before muttering something under his breath and motioning for us to keep moving. 10 minutes later, we found the rest of the deer. Its body was torn apart, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and its ribcage gaped open like a grotesque, bloodied cage. The smell hit me before I could fully process what I was looking at. A thick, metallic stench that turned my stomach. Dad crouched down, examining the carcass with a grim expression. Bear, I thought, though the way the deer had been ripped apart didn't quite match what I knew of bear kills. Still, Dad didn't say much, and we moved on, the unease settling deeper in my chest. By the time we found a decent spot to wait, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows through the trees. We sat in silence for hours, scanning the forest for movement, but nothing came. The woods were eerily still, the usual rustling of squirrels or birds completely absent. It was like the forest itself was dead. As the afternoon wore on, the unease I'd been feeling all day grew heavier. At around 7 o'clock, we decided to head back to the trailer. The walk back was quiet, but when we finally reached the clearing, something was wrong. There were fresh tracks near our truck. Not deer or elk or bear, but something much larger. The prints were deep and elongated, almost human but far too big. Each print sank into the dirt, leaving a claw-like impression at the toes. I froze, staring at them, my heart hammering in my chest. Dad's face went pale as he scanned the area, his grip tightening on his rifle. Without a word, he motioned for me to get in the truck. We drove out of there fast, the headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The narrow road was lined with trees so dense they seemed to swallow the light. The further we drove, the more I felt like we were being watched. It was just a feeling at first, but then I saw it. Movement in the corner of my eye. My head snapped toward the trees, and for a split second, I saw it. Yellow eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. They were set high, far too high to belong to a deer or bear. Before I could say anything, Dad slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, and he grabbed his flashlight, stepping out without hesitation. I stayed in the cab, my hands gripping the seat, my heart pounding. He swept the flashlight beam across the trees, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones, which jutted out at sharp angles. It moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. The flashlight caught its eyes, and they reflected back an otherworldly yellow. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at us, and then it bolted into the bushes with a speed that didn't seem possible. Dad raised his rifle and fired a shot into the trees. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, and the creature let out a screech, a high-pitched, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. He fired again, but by then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. Without a word, Dad climbed back into the truck and gunned the engine. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the forest fading into the rearview mirror. We never spoke about what we saw that night. Dad acted like it never happened, and I didn't dare bring it up. But the image of that thing, its glowing eyes, its skeletal frame, has never left me. To this day, I don't know what it was or where it came from, All I know is that something out there was watching us, something that didn't belong. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that screech echoing in my mind. Camping has always been something I enjoyed. It was my way of escaping the noise of the city, the routines, and the deadlines that made life feel like a constant race. Over the years, I've camped in countless places, from state parks to remote forests where there wasn't another soul for miles. But as much as I loved being out there, I've come to realize there's something eerie about how nature operates. It doesn't care about you. It doesn't follow your rules or schedules. And it doesn't give you warnings. The trip that still sticks with me happened in the summer of 2019. I was 32 at the time, and I had planned a long weekend camping trip to a forest in northern Minnesota. The area was known for its tall pine trees, clear lakes, and quiet trails. I picked a spot near a small lake called Black Hollow, tucked away enough to avoid most of the weekend traffic, but close enough to the main trailhead that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent near the tree line, about 20 feet from where the lake started. The air was cool, the stars were bright, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the soft lapping of water on the shore. I cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove, read a book by flashlight, and went to bed early. I felt relaxed and at peace. But by the next afternoon, that peaceful feeling was gone. I had just finished a morning hike and was back at my campsite, sitting in a foldable chair by the fire pit. I was staring out at the lake, letting my mind wander, when I heard a sharp, splintering crack. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker or some animal rustling in the trees. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, deeper, like the groaning of something heavy struggling to stay upright. I looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, and that's when I saw it. One of the tall pine trees near the lake was leaning, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind, but slowly tipping like it had just decided it couldn't stand anymore. It crashed down into the water with an enormous splash, sending ripples across the surface and scaring off a flock of birds that had been perched nearby. The noise was so sudden, so violent, that it made my heart race. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. There hadn't been any storm, no strong winds, no lightning, just a tree that decided to fall for no reason. I shook it off, chalking it up to something I didn't understand. Maybe the tree was old or its roots had rotted out. I spent the rest of the day fishing by the lake and gathering wood for a fire. But the image of that tree falling kept replaying in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it tipping, the water erupting, the sound echoing through the forest. That night, I built a fire and tried to enjoy the quiet. The stars were out again, and the air smelled like pine and smoke. But I couldn't shake the unease. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, made me jump. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Trees fall all the time. It's just part of being in the woods. But I couldn't convince myself completely. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside. It was mostly quiet, just the occasional chirp of crickets or the hoot of an owl. I was starting to drift off when I heard it again. That same splintering, groaning sound. My heart pounded as I scrambled out of my tent, grabbing my flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trunks of the surrounding trees. I scanned the area and then I saw it. Another tree, this one much closer to my campsite, slowly tipping over. The crack of wood breaking filled the air, and then it came crashing down, landing just a few feet from where my tent was set up. I stood there, shaking, staring at the massive trunk lying on the ground. If it had fallen just a little to the left, it would have crushed my tent. and me along with it. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the fire, keeping it going through the night, and jumped at every noise. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I felt like the forest was trying to tell me something, and I didn't like what it had to say. The next morning, I debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of cutting my trip short felt like admitting defeat, like I was letting fear win. So I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease. By the time I got back to my campsite, I was exhausted. I made a quick dinner, started another fire, and sat there staring into the flames, trying to convince myself everything was fine. And then it happened again. This time, I didn't hear the groaning or the cracking. I just heard the crash. It was louder than the other two, and when I turned around, I saw a massive pine tree lying across the campsite next to mine. There was a truck parked there, and for a moment I thought the worst. The tree had fallen right on top of the tent. My stomach dropped as I ran over, flashlight in hand, shouting for help. When I got there, I realized the tent was empty. The guy who had been staying there, an older man I'd seen fishing earlier, was sitting in his truck, staring at me through the windshield with wide eyes. He rolled down the window and explained he'd been napping in the truck when the tree came down. He wasn't hurt, but he was shaken. I offered to help clear the tree, but we both knew it wasn't something we could handle on our own. He said he'd call someone with a chainsaw to come out in the morning. I went back to my campsite, but I didn't bother trying to sleep. I packed up my gear, loaded it into my car, and drove to the nearest rest stop. I spent the rest of the night in the driver's seat, staring out the window at the empty parking lot, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, I drove home. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been trying to get rid of me, like it didn't want me there. I told myself it was just bad luck, just a string of coincidences. But even now, years later, I can't look at a tree the same way. Every time I go camping, I find myself scanning the branches, checking for signs of weakness, listening for that awful, splintering sound. Because sometimes nature doesn't need a reason. It just decides it's your turn. And when it does, you'd better hope you're ready. I was sent to a lonely spot near the border, deep in the woods where the US meets Mexico. The job was simple. Keep an eye on the area, report anything strange, and walk the trails. The forest stretched out endlessly, quiet and almost too empty. My camp was basic, a small tent, a fire pit, and a folding chair facing the trees. The only sign of people was a dirt road about a mile away. By the second night, I couldn't shake the nervous feeling in my gut. It was the kind of feeling you get when everything's too quiet for too long. I hadn't seen anything strange during my patrols, but something felt wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation messing with me. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire when I saw a faint light flickering in the distance. It wasn't the moon or stars. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and headed toward it. I walked for about 20 minutes, stepping over roots and pushing past bushes. The light didn't move. It just stayed in the same spot like a campfire someone had left burning. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire. It was a lantern hanging from a tree branch, swaying back and forth. Below it, the dirt looked freshly dug up, like someone had buried something there. My heart started beating faster. There were no footprints, no bags, no sign of anyone around, just the lantern swinging above that patch of dirt. Standing there in the open made me feel exposed. Every instinct I had told me to leave, but I knew I couldn't without checking it out. I grabbed a stick and poked at the dirt. It was loose, like someone had been digging recently. I thought about digging deeper but stopped. I didn't want to know what was under there. As I stood up, the lantern suddenly went out. The darkness hit me like a wave. My flashlight barely cut through it. I spun around, shining the beam in every direction, but I didn't see anything. Just my own shallow breathing and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I turned and started heading back to camp, walking fast but trying not to panic. My radio crackled with static, breaking the silence. I tried to use it, but the signal was too weak. I walked faster, checking over my shoulder every few steps. Felt like something was watching me, staying just out of sight. When I reached my camp, my stomach dropped. Everything was trashed. My tent was ripped open, my gear was scattered everywhere, and my fire had been put out. Whatever had done this couldn't have gone far. My truck was parked a few yards away, and I sprinted to it. As I climbed in, I saw something on the hood, a small, bloody handprint. It was tiny, like it belonged to a child. I locked the doors and started the engine. My headlights lit up the trees, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the light. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I couldn't make out the face, but the way it was standing, so still, made my skin crawl. I slammed on the gas and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. When I got back to the station, I reported everything. They sent a team to check the area, but they didn't find anything. No lantern, no dug-up ground, nothing. My camp looked untouched, like I'd never even been there. I quit the job the next morning. Whatever was out there wasn't something I could deal with. But the part that still keeps me up at night, sometimes I wonder if I wasn't alone from the start. Maybe it had been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't done with me yet. That night, the rain came earlier than I thought. I had set up my tent at the edge of a small clearing deep in the forest, far from anyone or anything. I wanted quiet, to be alone, to hear nothing but the sound of the trees and the rain. I got that, and something I didn't want. The rain started soft at first, tapping gently on the tent. I zipped myself in and lay back, enjoying the sound as it grew steadier. It was peaceful, like a soft rhythm, mixed with the far-off sound of thunder. But soon it got louder. The drops came faster, harder, almost as if the sky was angry. The wind picked up, bending the trees and shaking the poles of my tent. I started to wonder if I had set it up tight enough. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't fit. Over the rain and wind, I heard the crunch of wet leaves, slow and steady. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or something small. But the sound didn't feel right. It wasn't quick or careful like an animal would be. It was slow, heavy, and steady like a person walking. I froze, holding my breath. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, but the steps kept coming closer and closer. I wanted to look, but the tent's thin fabric blocked my view. My stomach tightened as I realized how far away I was from anyone. There was no phone signal, no one nearby. If something happened, no one would hear me. The steps stopped, right outside my tent. My heart was beating so loudly, it felt like the whole forest could hear it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the rain playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. I didn't move, barely breathing, hoping whatever it was would leave. But then I heard it, a faint sound, almost hidden by the storm. A zipper, not mine and not far away. Somewhere outside, another tent was being unzipped. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No other tents, no sign of campers. No one was supposed to be here but me. My chest tightened as my thoughts raced. Maybe someone had arrived after dark, but I would have noticed their flashlight or a fire. Unless they didn't want me to know they were here. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could grab it, the footsteps started again. This time, they circled my tent, slow and deliberate. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. My only plan was to stay as quiet as I could. The footsteps stopped again, and for a moment, the rain was the only sound. Then, without warning, the side of my tent shook hard, like someone had grabbed it and pulled. My body stiffened. My mind raced. I didn't have anything to defend myself with. Not a knife, not even a stick. Just this thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was outside. Another pull, harder this time, and I heard a grunt. Not an animal's grunt. Person's. They were trying to scare me, testing to see how I'd react. And in that moment, I knew if I stayed here, I wasn't going to see the morning. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to slip out and ran. The rain hit my face like tiny needles, but I didn't care. I ran blindly toward the trees, holding my flashlight but not turning it on. The ground was slippery, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't stop. I didn't know how far I ran before I finally dropped to the ground behind a fallen tree. My chest burned, and I couldn't catch my breath. I turned off the flashlight and listened, praying I'd lost whoever it was. For a moment, there was only rain. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the mud, heavy and searching. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the tree. They were close. I could hear their breathing now, steady and slow, as if they weren't tired at all. I stayed there, frozen, until the steps started to fade. Even then, I didn't move. When the storm finally started to ease at dawn, I forced myself to get up. My legs ached and I was soaked to the bone. I didn't go back to the tent. I left everything behind. My gear, my phone, everything, and walked straight to my car. By the time I got there, I was shaking, both from the cold and the fear. I drove without stopping, not even bothering to look in the mirror. It wasn't until I was miles away that I realized how much I had lost. But none of it mattered. That night, something had followed me. Not just in the forest, but all the way to the edge of my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I think I still hear it. The crunch of wet leaves, the slow steps getting closer. I don't know if it's real or just my imagination, but I do know one thing. I will never feel safe camping again. I was always close to my grandma. She grew up in a quiet village in the hills and used to tell me how clean the air was and how peaceful the nights felt there. When I suggested we go camping near her old village, she surprised me by saying yes. She even said it might be nice to visit the place where she grew up one last time. We left early in the morning, driving along narrow roads that twisted through thick forests. After a couple of hours, we found a small open area by a river. Grandma seemed happy, quietly humming to herself as she unpacked the blankets and food. While she gathered firewood, I set up the tent close to the trees. The day felt calm. The sound of the river and the breeze through the trees made everything feel peaceful. We cooked over the fire and watched the sun go down behind the hills. As night fell, the stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them. Grandma started talking about her childhood, how she used to pick wild berries and help take care of goats. She seemed happier than I'd seen her in a long time. When it got late, I went into the tent to sleep, but Grandma said she wanted to stay out a bit longer. She said the air felt fresh, and she wasn't tired yet. I didn't think much of it and fell asleep pretty quickly. Sometime later, I woke up to a faint noise, like leaves rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I glanced over, I saw that Grandma still wasn't in the tent. I felt a small knot of worry forming. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the forest around us felt darker than before. I called out for her softly, but there was no reply. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, sweeping the light across the clearing. At first, I thought she might have wandered off to stretch her legs. Then I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were small, like a child's, but Grandma didn't have small feet, and these didn't match her shoes. The tracks led into the forest and vanished in the shadows. Panic started to rise. I called her name louder this time, my voice echoing back at me. That's when I saw a piece of her shawl caught on a low branch. I grabbed it and followed the direction the footprints seemed to go. The trail led me to a narrow, overgrown path I hadn't noticed before. I hesitated, but then started walking down it, my flashlight lighting the way. The further I went, the stranger everything felt. The air smelled wet and sour, and the quiet was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Finally, I saw her. She was sitting on the edge of an old stone well, her back facing me. Relief hit me, and I started to move closer, but something made me stop. She wasn't moving. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and her hands rested in her lap like she was waiting for something. I called her name again, and she slowly turned to look at me. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked empty, like she wasn't really seeing me. I stepped closer, but before I could say anything, she shook her head. "Go back to the tent," she said, her voice flat and cold. "Don't wait for me. Just go." I froze, not sure what to do, but the look in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I turned and walked back, even though I wanted to run. The path felt darker, and every sound made me jump. When I got back to the campsite, I sat in the tent, my heart racing. I kept telling myself she would return soon, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I stayed awake all night, listening for her footsteps, but she never came back. At sunrise, I went back to the well. She was gone. Her shawl was folded neatly on the edge of the stone, but there was no other sign of her. I searched everywhere, calling her name, but it was like she had disappeared. The police came later and searched the area. They said the well was dry and hadn't been used in decades. They thought she might have wandered off and gotten lost, but I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't explain the footprints or the way she acted before she vanished. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the look on her face when she told me to leave. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was something else, something I can't put into words. I haven't gone back to that village since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her sitting by the well, her head tilted just so, waiting for something or someone. And I can't help but feel that whatever it was, it's still out there, watching and waiting. It had been 2 years since my wife passed, but the pain in my chest never really went away. We used to go camping together every summer, and I thought maybe going back to one of our favorite spots would help me feel like she was still with me. The idea of being alone in the woods was a bit scary, but I thought I could handle it. I packed up the old tent, her favorite lantern, and some other stuff I thought I might need, and left early in the morning. The drive to the campsite was quiet. The only sounds were the tires on the road and the faint hum of the radio. When I finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky. The trail to the campsite was overgrown, and the air felt thicker than I remembered. I figured it was just me being nervous. Setting up camp was harder than I thought. Every time I pulled something out of my bag, it reminded me of her. I remembered how she used to laugh when I couldn't figure out the tent poles, how she'd always want to make the fire, even though I was better at it. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had almost gone down, and the forest felt darker than usual. I made a small fire and sat by it, listening to the sounds of the woods. The fire crackled, leaves rustled, and I could hear the occasional chirp of a cricket. It was peaceful, almost like the old days. I thought maybe coming here wasn't such a bad idea after all. Then I heard something, a sharp snap of a branch behind me. My stomach tightened. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Deer were common around here, But the sound didn't stop. It was like footsteps, moving through the brush, going in circles around my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. I tried to focus on the fire, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I realized something. The noises weren't random. They seemed to be moving on purpose, stopping every time I turned my head. I decided it was time to go to bed. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Lying there in the dark, I felt every muscle in my body tense, waiting for any sound. For a while, it was quiet, and I began to relax. But then I heard a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. It was getting closer. I held my breath, my heart racing. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I reached for the small knife I always kept in my bag and gripped it tight, waiting. Every second felt like an hour. Then, out of nowhere, the fabric of the tent pushed inward, like someone or something was pressing against it. My hand tightened around the knife so hard that my fingers hurt. I stayed as still as I could, not daring to move. After a long time, the pressure stopped. The scraping noise slowly faded away into the distance. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the knife. Every little sound made my heart skip. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed up my stuff and left. I wanted out of there as quickly as possible. On my way back, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. About 50 feet from where my camp had been, the ground was disturbed. Fresh dirt was piled up like something had been buried there recently. It wasn't just an animal, I knew that much. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that whatever had been circling my camp was still out there, watching. That trip was supposed to give me peace, but instead, it only left me with a deep, sinking feeling I couldn't shake. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't plan to. What gets to me the most is the thought that maybe something was waiting for me to leave, like it knew I was going to pack up. Maybe it wanted me to see that disturbed ground on my way out. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure it wasn't just a wild animal, and I don't think it was finished with me yet.